Indigenous Social Welfare Reform Proposal. We start with the outline for the proposal, beginning with territorial acknowledgement. Then we move into Wolf family case scenario, barriers and challenges affecting Ruth the mom and Kevin the son. Next, issues and challenges impeding Indigenous families. Then we move into BC Treaty Commission. Then visions of change towards Indigenous social policy in British Columbia. Followed by Bill 26-2018, Child, Family and Community Service Amendment Act 2018. Then we move back to visions of change towards Indigenous social policy in British Columbia, and we follow that up with references. Territorial acknowledgement. I am taking this time to acknowledge that I am situated on the unceded territories of the Lekwungen and WSÁNEĆ people. As I continually walk these lands, I will always be mindful and respectful of the Indigenous protocols set forth with the utmost respect. I also need to acknowledge my Indigenous ancestors, elders, knowledge keepers, storytellers, and medicine peoples for their past, present, and future teachings as they have and continue to breathe life into Indigenous ways of living, knowing, and being. I would also like to acknowledge my Creator for allowing myself to experience all the wonderful gifts that my Mother Earth provides to me every single day. Wolf family case scenario, barriers and challenges that affect Ruth the mom and Kevin the son. Challenges are single parenting. After school programs have added costs, racism and harassment within the public school system, lack of Indigenous education within the public school system, disconnection from cultural ways of being, knowing, and living, employment opportunities for Indigenous youth, housing, and lack of employment opportunities. Issues and challenges impeding Indigenous families. Their health, poor living conditions due to poverty, and not having affordable access to healthy foods. Indigenous people have seen a rise in health complications such as diabetes and heart disease. Their education. Due to the effects of colonialism and residential schools, way too many Indigenous peoples have been denied their right to a good education. Many Indigenous peoples have also dropped out of schools due to racism and bullying. Poverty. Due to high rates of unemployment and substantially lower incomes, many Indigenous people struggle to even afford the most basic necessities, such as nutritional foods and means of transportation. Inadequate housing. Housing. Because of poverty levels on many reserves, Indigenous people can't afford to repair or maintain their deteriorating homes. Another problem is overcrowding within their homes. Unemployment. Unemployment rates within Indigenous communities is much higher than the rest of Canada. The BC Treaty Commission. When looking into the case of the Wolf family and the barriers and challenges, those challenges pertain to some common provisions that the BC Treaty Commission brings to light, which are education, language and culture, healthcare, housing, and child welfare. Okay, this is my vision of change towards Indigenous social policy in British Columbia and across Canada, referring to education. The Wolf family case scenario is a very common example of how Indigenous families can be negatively affected by the current social policies that are in place. Let us begin with education. First Nations children have substantially higher dropout rates than non-First Nations students. Statistically speaking, let's look at the dropout rate of First Nations students. Cheryl Sutherland is a content editor opinion for the Globe and Mail. She states, 6 out of 10 First Nation students who live on reserves drop out of high school. How do we substantially lower these dropout rates? I propose we implement Indigenous-led educational schools on the land of reservations that would be fully operated by Indigenous councils and financially funded by the federal government. Students would be submerged into an environment that would be free of a colonialist way of knowing and being, and would be free of a racist and biased environment. Within these schools, faculty would consist of Indigenous and non-Indigenous teachers. Now you may ask yourself, why would you bring non-Indigenous teachers into the settings? In a YouTube video entitled TLC Discusses Being a Good Indigenous Ally, host Sandy Boucher reiterates her guest comments when she says, being an ally is not a title. It's not something you just claim. It's not something on a business card. It's action-oriented. I believe that many of you can be meaningful allies through working as teachers within Indigenous education, run and led school systems. So let's continue with visions of change towards Indigenous social policy in British Columbia and across Canada. And let's look at the cultural component. Culture would be an imperative component to be embedded with this Indigenous-led school system. One component of this curriculum would be an actual on-the-land culturally based teachings program. Students would learn their ancestral ways of harvesting, fishing, and ceremony. Obviously, demographics will play a huge role in how each school would structure their program because of the diversity of ways of knowing, living, and being among the many diverse nations across British Columbia. In week 7, we discussed Indigenous land and water welfare. In the YouTube video, People of the Land, Roy Salapri, who is Dene Elder of Meander River First Nation, talks about respecting the land and the animals that live within the land. Roy teaches the importance of respect within his natural surroundings. Roy talks about this respect when he says, the water is something that is part of me, and I need to respect the water. I gotta respect the water because if the water changes, then my life's gonna change with it. Roy then says, if you respect the moose will respect you back. And if you respect the river will respect you back and will look after you. The cultural land and water teachings, such as what is taught by Roy Salapri, will be an imperative component of this Indigenous school system. All of you students can greatly benefit as being non-Indigenous teachers by participating in the on-the-land, culturally based teachings program. By retaining this knowledge, you yourself can be advocates of your own Mother Earth and all of her treasures as you walk through your lives in a good way. So let's continue with my vision of change towards Indigenous social policy in British Columbia and across Canada. And let's look at healthcare. For many Indigenous peoples, the 4 elements of the medicine wheel, physical, mental, spiritual, and emotional, is a sacred path towards leading a healthy life. If you are sick in any one of these 4 elements, then the effects transfer to the other 3 elements within the wheel. Indigenous people need to be able to access programs and services that emphasize culturally safe environments. I propose that the federal government provide funding for a newly developed Indigenous elder program that would allow for an Indigenous individual to take a paid leave of 3 weeks from their place of employment to participate in an Indigenous-led mental health and substance abuse program without the loss of employment or discrimination from doing so. Author Cindy Baskins brings to light elder teachings by writing. Indigenous worldviews incorporate ways of turning inward for the purpose of finding meanings through, for example, prayer, fasting, dream interpretation, ceremonies, and silence. Then Baskins goes on to say, our ancestors left us these methods through the generational teachings that are passed on by our elders and through our blood memories. This elder program would be operated in the most metropolitan cities. The federal funding would be accessible to Indigenous elders. who would like to participate by teaching and implementing their own ways of knowing and being within their own cultural teachings, combined with the policies set forth within the core values of the program itself. This way, there will be a great diversity of cultural accessibility to whomever the sick Indigenous person chooses to use in their healing journey, as well as employment opportunity for many Indigenous elders that would benefit in their own lives as well. Indigenous people that seek these healing opportunities will be encompassed in healing circles that would encourage safe cultural spaces. Once again, as an ally, you students can work alongside Indigenous helpers and receive a portion of this federal funding in developing recruiting centers that will consistently seek out Indigenous elders for these cultural healing positions, as this will be a permanent ongoing component for the success of this program. Now I'd like to take a moment to voice my concern about Bill 26, 2018, Child and Family and Community Services Amendment Act. What is Bill 26? It is the Child, Family and Community Services Act 2018. This bill is designed as a set of rules that the Ministry of Child and Family Development, MCFD, is to use when they are working with children and families. In 2018, amendments were made to Bill 26 pertaining to the well-being of Indigenous families and their children without consulting any Indigenous leadership councils. The First Nations Leadership Council publicly voiced their concerns by stating, "The amendments do not lay the foundation for the more significant shift required to change the child welfare conditions where the overrepresentation of First Nations children in care remains the most serious issue." I fully agree with the statement, as this is once again colonialist oppression. A statement was also released by the BC Aboriginal Justice Council on the amendments that were made to Bill 26. Co-chair of the BC Aboriginal Justice Council, Nancy Sandy, states, "This is unacceptable in light of the need to reconcile past historical justices in Indigenous children welfare and the 60s scoop." Now I'd like to discuss my vision of change towards Indigenous social policy in British Columbia and across Canada, and let's talk about housing. The TRC calls to action number 7, eliminate education and employment gap, should consistently focus on solutions and not just rhetoric from the federal government. Within the February 2018 federal budget, there was a commitment made to establish an Indigenous employment program. I believe that one national program cannot hold all the cards. This simply will not work. Housing is a huge issue for many Indigenous peoples on most reservations. Fortunately, there is a business model that is already in play that I believe would have incredible benefits if this model can be expanded on a national scale. The company is called YC Homes. This business model mission statement is housing through education. They go on to state that they run on a series of workshops, training programs, and activities that was created in partnership by YC Homes and First Nation educators. I believe that a similar business model can be run by individual reservations themselves. I would focus on provincial funding and or grants to be established through provincial government and not federal government. This is because each provincial government would have its own specific building code regulations. These building codes differentiate from province to province. Their Housing Through Education program teaches youth with Indigenous communities on reservations to build houses on reserves. As these Indigenous students learn important trades such as plumbing, education, and carpentry skills, they are receiving hands-on-the-job training. Once they finish building the new house for the Indigenous family to move into, the youth will now have the skills to build more housing on their reservations. Trades and education are imperative to building a strong community, and this is also a strong incentive for the youth to remain within their community with good paying jobs. Now I'd like to sum up my vision of change towards Indigenous social policy in British Columbia and across Canada and talk about what is most important to me is child welfare. Indigenous children and teenagers have been negatively subjected to the residential school system, the 60s scoop, and currently they are being overrepresented within the child welfare system. There is a strong movement through many Indigenous leadership councils to substantially lower the child welfare statistics. Federal and provincial governments across Canada may have good intentions to improve legislation regarding the well-being of Indigenous children. The biggest mistake that governments continue to make is the undeniable lack of consultation with First Nation leaders and councils. I propose we need an Indigenous-led Ministry of Child and Family Development division that is completely excluded from all obligations to the federal government and completely out of MCFD's jurisdiction when working with Indigenous families and children. I believe that you fellow students, after taking this course, can be fully competent allies and work for this new Indigenous Ministry of Child and Family Development that would be overseen by each province's First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Indigenous Leadership Councils that would include whatever forms of allyship support they choose and their rights to self-govern their own people's affairs.